Good morning, sir. Welcome to the CNSS podcast. We're so happy to have you here with us.
Thank you very much, Uma. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start off by, asking you about your experience as a career diplomat, which has been rich, interesting, and unique. If you can share a little bit about that, and then we'll move on to some of your accomplishments and achievements itself.
Well, I think, I was studying at JNU and had registered for my PhD. And I sent a message to my father and told him that I had a Government of India scholarship and to do my PhD. And he responded very cryptically, sent me a postcard saying that while indeed I am delighted, have you decided what you want to do with your life? Because you just drifted into doing PhD. You want to be an academic, or you don't want to be an academic. I mean, you first take a decision on that. And so I applied for some jobs, actually. And one of them was to take the UPSC examination. I also applied for this TAS, the Tata Administrative Service.
Right.
And a couple of others. And I managed to get through the UPSC exams, and I told my father about it. What really, and I had just put the Indian Foreign Service as the first preference. And I remember going for the interview, and the members of the interview board, the chairman asked me why I had put the Indian Foreign Service. And I said I wanted to travel around, I wanted to see the world, meet new people, understand new cultures. And he said, that's all very fine. Why don't you join a travel agency? Because the Indian Foreign Service is not meant to just do that. There's something more than that. And God knows, the period that I've spent there, 3.5 decades, been absolutely wonderful. Not just the quality of the work,
Right.
not just the wonderful people that you meet and different cultures and civilizations. I mean, Egypt was my first posting.
Wow.
And what a fascinating country. You see the relationship between India and these countries. But more importantly, I think it was the colleagues in the Foreign Service who made it all worthwhile. You know, starting from the foreign secretaries of the different foreign secretaries, one met, one interacted with. As a junior officer, you didn't meet them, you heard about them. But they were inspirational. The colleagues that you worked with, the ones you interacted with, were just simply outstanding. So I look back, and it was such an enriching experience. Given a chance to live my life again, I'd do the same thing.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
You've been to, some very interesting places as part of your postings. You started with Cairo, and then you moved to Brussels.
Yes, indeed.
And
then to Nepal.
Right.
Then I moved to Berlin. Then I moved to Sydney. Then I moved to Manila. In between, I did a number of stints in the Ministry of External Affairs, in South Block, as they called it.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, great time.
Your stint in Nepal happened at a very difficult period for the country.
Yes.
Right? I mean, there were many incidents that actually drove India-Nepal relations at that point of time. So would you share that with us and how you were able to navigate?
Well, there were two things, actually. One was that during my posting in Kathmandu, I wasn't part of the Indian Embassy. I was on deputation with the SAARC Secretariat. And so I headed the Economic and Trade Wing. But I was also the head of the Secretary General's office.
Okay.
And so it brought me in touch with all the SAARC member states. And in a very different way with the people and the government of Nepal, as compared to my colleagues in the embassy, because my colleagues in the embassy dealt with them on a daily basis, and that was their only focus.
Right.
Whereas for me, it was of a different nature. Nepal was one of the SAARC member states. But we were living in Kathmandu. And while living in Kathmandu, you meet common Nepalese people. And I met a number of journalists, and I have a fondness for academia. I met many academics and writers, and of course people in government, including people at the Royal Palace. And you realize that this is a brother country, you know, and someone you share a border with. But more importantly, it is a brother country. And the difference in size places an obligation on the bigger country to recognize its responsibility towards Nepal. And, you know, if you are seen as a collaborative experience, if you're seen as someone who is friendly and brotherly, then you're able to understand all the difficulties that they go through. And God knows, as you would have read, you know, Nepal went through one of the biggest tragedies with the earthquake.
Yes.
You know, the lives they lost, the ancient monument that broke and fell to the ground. You know, it's not easy for a nation and for a people to see the destruction by nature of their culture and civilizational history. So I fell in love, and so did my family. My mother was with me. We just fell in love with Nepal and the people, and I still hold them in very high respect and affection. It was a blessing, actually, to be there. And the SAARC job allowed me to travel within the SAARC region. And so, you know, I was introduced to Sri Lanka and to Bhutan, to Bangladesh, to the Maldives, and of course to Pakistan. And you then realize the common interests at the same time, the big differences.
Right.
I mean, you may have a lot of similarities and a lot of things with either Nepal or with Bangladesh or with Sri Lanka, but they're different. They're sovereign states.
Correct.
And I think it's very important for us to recognize that being together doesn't necessarily mean you're the same.
Yeah.
You must appreciate differences, and appreciation must translate into respect.
Absolutely.
And, you know, a strong neighborhood is in your interest. And strengthening the neighborhood then becomes your responsibility.
So well said, sir. So well said. So from Nepal, you moved back to the MEA? Was that?
No, from Nepal I moved, I mean, the whole family and I moved to Berlin.
Okay.
And so had a fantastic ambassador in Berlin. But during the 4+ years.
So that was a longer stint for you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Nepal I did for about 4 years. Berlin I did for 4.5. And a large part of that period I was the acting ambassador.
Okay.
Because my ambassador, I had 2 ambassadors there. One followed the other. The person who followed didn't join immediately after. So, I mean, these things happen.
Right.
Gaps take place. So it was great to be able to do a European posting. But more importantly, to see a country like Germany and how it interfaces with India. You see, we grew up as children thinking about Max Muller and his view of India.
Yes.
And the most extraordinary thing was no German had ever heard of Max Muller. And it was, you know, so I would go around saying Max Muller, and they would say, what are you talking about? You know, so, you know, your mind changes, you shift. We grew up as in the school I studied.
Yeah.
Some of my favorite authors were German. Hermann Hesse and Thomas Mann and Goethe.
Right.
and you listen to music and composers who are German.
Absolutely.
There is, of course, the awkward German history of the Nazi period and the Third Reich, and what they did to the Jews and to many other people, 6 million of them that they annihilated. And you think of a German company called Siemens, which has been here for about 170 years.
Yeah.
But Germany didn't think India was that important, right?
While you were there.
That's what I discovered.
Okay.
And what they did was, historical reasons, Marshall Plan and rebuilding of Germany. Germany became Eurocentric. They were the strongest economy in Europe. They, for want of a better English word, I think they outsourced their thinking on Asia to Washington. And I still remember that going to the German Foreign Office a day after India conducted its nuclear test, and my counterpart colleague at the Foreign Office was shocked and said, "You have a nuclear test? We knew nothing about it. I read about it in the paper." And what it did to me was to make me recognize that India was so unimportant for the Germans that the fact that you're conducting a nuclear test is something you get to know about through second-hand knowledge. You get it from a newspaper, you get it from Washington, D.C. sending a cable, or the U.S. ambassador doing a briefing. But all that's changed.
Yes.
Dramatically changed. And I still remember Chancellor Schroeder, so he started rethinking about India, but it was still India and China. China was his preference. Till China actually pulled some fast ones on him. And one of the great fast ones they did was Germany had made this high-speed train.
Okay.
And the Germans were going to visit China. And so he took along this high-speed train to show it to the Chinese so that he could sell it to them. And the Chinese said, you know what, you leave this train behind. We have to test run it to see whether we really want to buy it. It made sense. But then he suddenly discovered, Germans suddenly discovered, that China had copied the train.
Wow.
And didn't need to buy it from the Germans anymore. They could sell it to the Germans.
Right.
Because of their manufacturing capabilities. But I think the huge, dramatic shift took place under the chancellorship of an absolutely wonderful human being, Angela Merkel.
Right.
She took over as chancellor. And she and Dr. Manmohan Singh got along very well. And then, of course, the relationship consolidated, was built by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And I believe that today, Germany and India have one of the strongest relationships in multiple sectors.
Right.
So I think relationships between countries, bilateral relationships, go up and down. And every country will ask itself, what do I get out of this relationship? Is it worth having? Most certainly you can have Indology studies, which is what, studying India by the Germans, they know Sanskrit and, et cetera, et cetera. It's a great thing.
Right.
But that's not what you base a relationship on. How much Indology would you do?
Correct.
You must encourage it, well, no doubt. Ultimately, it's trade, it's defense, it's security,
Yes.
it's politics, it's parliamentarians meeting, it's young people meeting, it's media, the whole gamut is completely different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which, brings me to what you started in the Ministry of External Affairs, the Division of Public Diplomacy. You have been the pioneer there, and you laid down the foundation for Indian foreign policy to look at public diplomacy in a very different way. What actually triggered this whole concept of public diplomacy to come into being as part of our foreign policy? How did it shape when you started it, and where do you see it now?
Yeah, I'd completed my tenure in Berlin and headed back. The public diplomacy division was already created, and my colleague, the late Arif Khan was the additional secretary. A wonderful young colleague of mine called Sunil Lal was posted as the first joint secretary, public diplomacy. But then he stayed for a very short period, for a month or so, and then he moved on.
Okay.
And I took over and stayed there for a couple of years. And I still remember Shankar Menon was the foreign secretary. I still remember going to him and saying, "Sir, what do I do? What do you want the public diplomacy division to be all about?" And Shankar Menon said, "Why don't you go and meet the minister?" The minister was Pranab Mukherjee.
Okay.
And ask the minister what he would like. So I did go across to see minister, and he was busy doing some work, and I was sitting across his table when he finished doing what he was doing. Then he bent down and took out a piece of paper. It was an A4 size white piece of paper, blank on both sides. And he gave me that piece of paper and said, "What you write on it is policy."
Wow.
Gave me a complete carte blanche. And it is one of, I think I've enjoyed all my postings at the MEA and missions abroad. But this one was so wonderful because you were allowed to create something and you let your imagination flow. And at the end of the day, the focus really was on how do you correct distortion. You know, I'll give you an example, Umar. You see, the British didn't quite like to leave India, did they?
Yes.
And, you know, books like Heat and Dust, the BBC's coverage of India, snake charmers and elephants roaming around, cows in the street, India, the land of poverty. I mean, why on earth would they want us to go? After all, we civilized these naked savages, didn't we? And so that view, that perception, that angst and that hatred about the so-called jewel in the crown. After all, they did steal that jewel, didn't they? And how do you change the way people think about India? I mean, India was seen as a poor country. And then God knows there are a lot of problems about India. You know, a slow bureaucracy. It is a country where certain parts are very hot.
Yes.
It is also a country where certain parts are exceedingly cold.
Very true.
It is most certainly not a country where you roam around with an umbrella all the time like you do in Britain. And most certainly, God knows, British cuisine has benefited from the cuisine of the migrants that they have, whether it's Chinese or Japanese or Indian.
True.
But having said that, I think public diplomacy, as Joseph Nye created the term soft power,
Yes.
speaks about, is that how do you complement traditional diplomacy? And how do you work side by side? How do you reach out to people and tell them the India story? You know, and how the India story is a story that they too can embrace, in as much as you embrace the Nepal story or the Sri Lanka story and work together. So, yeah, I loved my tenure. We did a lot of wonderful things, working with different governments, different arms of the government. During the period that I was Joint Secretary, we had the horrible 26/11 take place, the famous, the manner in which a neighboring country decided to disrupt situations, take lives,
Yes.
not just of Indians, but of non-Indian foreigners and tourists, to give the impression that this is a country which you shouldn't visit. It has problems, it is unstable, and the manner in which the government of India handled it subsequently. I mean, today that neighboring country is a pariah country.
Absolutely. Yes.
And of course, many things helped. It helped that the Navy SEALs carried out the execution of Osama bin Laden at Abbottabad, next door to a military base of that country. So I think public diplomacy is a very powerful instrument. And today I work for an international university. And there is evidence to demonstrate that when you measure soft power, education is a critical part of that. And you can promote bilateral relations. And Pandit Nehru's time, foreign policy, we opened our doors to poor countries from Africa and from Asia. And we said, let's not reinvent the wheel, come and study here. That was 1947. 1950, it became a critical part of our foreign policy.
Yes.
And in 2024, we are still receiving students, some of whom have become heads of state and government.
True.
Whether it's Fiji or Papua New Guinea or, going to Jamaica, Mauritius, Seychelles. I mean, these are people that we interacted with. After all, where you studied in your younger days, always has a special place in your heart, doesn't it?
Very true. Very, very
public
true.
Diplomacy.
Yes, very true. So, taking on that, taking off on what you mentioned about educational institutions, how do you see this this craze for Indian students to go to Western universities and study vis-a-vis using public diplomacy as a platform? Why haven't we been able to promote Indian students going to some of the island countries, some of the African countries, or even South American countries? The number is far, far less. So what would your advice be for, autonomous universities in India, especially the private ones? Because there's a tremendous amount of contribution that they can, do. How do you see that working out, and what would you advise them?
Great question, Uma. I mean, why do students go abroad to study in any country? I mean, why would a student from Ireland go to the US to study?
Right.
Why would a student from India go to Canada to study? I mean, there are two factors. One is called the push factor, and the other is called the pull factor.
Right.
Now, the pull factor really is the reputation of that country and educational institution. So the Americans, for example, for the past 7+ decades, indeed immediately after the Second World War, the Americans saw the education system as a good way to tell the American story, right? And, the American way of life, the music, the culture, the food, the freedom, the opportunity, the land of opportunity. Anyone can make it in the US. Work hard and you've got it. You've got talent, we recognize it. All of that became very attractive. And then, of course, the educational institutions, very high caliber, Nobel laureates, kind of academics that they went into. So that was the pull factor. That attracted Indian students. Many of the IIT students, as I was growing up, where are you going? I'm going to go abroad.
Going to the US,
and where is abroad? Abroad is US. That was the only destination. It still is the most prized destination. But there's a push factor. The push factor is a response to a supply-demand situation. And the supply and the Indian institutions, the ability to take in good students was limited.
Right.
And so the demand was burgeoning, it was growing. And today, with the growing middle class, the capacity to pay, there is a push factor. The students are being pushed out because the Indian institutions cannot absorb them and give them the kind of quality education that they want. I mean, there are very few IITs, isn't there?
Yes.
There are very few institutions like the Indian Institute of Science.
Yes.
And the one IIT, which is in the QS ranking, is 152.
True.
We don't feature in the top 10. We don't feature in the top 20. China has 2 institutions in the top 10.
Yes.
So there is then that push factor. Because young people would also like to do well in life. And you do well in life, the correlation you see is that if I get good education, I will get employability. According to a study, only 5% of India's engineers are employable.
Very true.
And this means really that we need to upgrade our own ability for domestic students and to become attractive. The new education policy, to some extent, is going to address that. But it's very important for private institutions to recognize that unless the quality of the faculty, the studying experience that is given to the students, unless this is enhanced, employability will not enhance. And then you will always have the push factor. They will seek other pastimes, usually abroad.
Yeah. So it also impacts, foreign students coming into India and studying, because like you said, the pull factor from the Indian universities towards foreign students to come here and study, that also gets impacted.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, you will, of course, get some foreign students, but not in the volumes that you want.
Yes.
And it doesn't become a revenue model then. I mean, I'll give you an example. The University of New South Wales, with which I am associated, has close to 68,000 students, of which over 20,000 are international students.
Wow.
That's a huge number.
That is a huge number.
Right? And they come from all over the world. Chinese students, Indian students, Irish, French, German. So that is because of the quality of education and the quality of research. You convert that into foreign policy when you say that what we do should help transform lives. And so let's have a bilateral understanding of what the India strategy means. Can we address India's developmental aspirations through the research that we do? And can we do it collaboratively? So when you do that, it's about foreign policy. But education becomes the instrument.
That is such an amazing way forward. It's a pity that we haven't been able to recognize that as one of the main contributors to revenue generation is definitely one of it. And again, great quality research, which can bring about so much of innovation in the country.
Indeed.
Collaborative innovation between, two countries, which also, sort of takes it forward to non-traditional security aspects that countries can partner on, climate change, intellectual property, all of this can be covered under the same gambit.
Absolutely.
Because I know you've been talking about all of this frequently. So
yeah, Uma, you've hit the nail on the head. I think the way we see the world of education, and indeed any other world that we interface with, the world of health, the world of infrastructure, has to undergo a critical and fundamental difference because times have changed.
yes.
I mean, when you and I were growing up, there was an outstanding book written by a man called Alvin Toffler. It was called Future Shock.
Future shock.
And what he argued was that the future is coming to you at such a speed that unless you cope with it, you'll be swept off your feet.
True.
And education has to undergo change, not just a shift. It has to be rewired. It has to be rethought because the demands are completely different.
Very true, sir. Very true. Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's been such a pleasure listening to you and having you share these thoughts. I mean, these were thoughts which have been going on in my head for a very long time, especially because I work in the education space. I think your views have sort of cemented, some of the thoughts that I've had personally. Thank you. Thank you very much for being on the CNSS podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been a real honor, Uma.
Thank you, sir.
And loved the conversation. Thank you.